The topic of this video is the notion of judgment, the judgment specifically that would come with death, where people who had died would be consigned to hell or sent to purgatory to suffer, or sent to some part of heaven which corresponded in some way with the good deeds that they had done, at least if we're drawing our inspiration from somebody like Dante about this. Death involved judgment. When one died, according to the Christian conception of this in the Middle Ages, people would, or they would be judged, right? And there are different depictions of judgment, the way that would happen, or the way that would happen to them. The judge is Christ in almost every depiction of this, but there are other people, other figures present at judgment, other imagery brought into this. The best way to appreciate notions of judgment is to look at artwork. The last judgment, meaning the judgment that would come at the end of the world, and so this has a specifically eschatological component to it. Eschatology meaning thoughts about the end of the world, the study of the end of the world. But the last judgment that would come with the end of the world, when Christ came again and judged the people who were, who had lived their mortal lives, right, occupied a great deal of attention of artists. This was probably the most common, very most common depiction of anything in artwork, especially in churches. Almost every church was adorned in some way with a depiction of judgment. And most often, at least for much of the Middle Ages, this was placed in a prominent position, like over the main door of the church. Churches tended to be oriented along cardinal directions, and the main door of the church was usually on the western side of the church, and judgment panels were most often put there. Later they were moved in the Gothic period to either the south or the north doors of the church, but it was still common to have them in a prominent position. The eschatology of this, right, in the medieval Christian conception of things, Christ would come again, would usher in, and this, comes from interpretations of imagery in the book of Revelation, would usher in a millennium of peace. Judgment would happen. Before that, there would be a period of calamity where a figure known as the Antichrist would emerge, and would lead people astray, claiming to be Christ come again. And there were lots of theories about what this would involve. Some very popular theories about, what was entailed in the end of the world and what to look for, and when it was coming, even, kind of specific predictions about when it would happen. Most famously, there was a 13th century figure named Joachim of Fiore in Italy, who came up with a whole detailed idea of the three ages of the world that corresponded with the three figures of the Trinity, and gave specific predictions of when the third age, the age of the Holy Spirit, would be ushered in and what would happen at that time. And so this occupied a great deal of attention. There was always a kind of connection with notions of judgment involved in the second coming of Jesus. We're going to look at some different artistic styles here, and this will take us chronologically through the High and Late Middle Ages. The type of art that flourished in the 11th and 12th centuries, and to some extent thereafter, was called Romanesque. That's because it adopted some features of Roman architecture, specifically the rounded arch. This image here on the slide is actually from a Romanesque church, and you can see the rounded arch above the tympanum here. This is later kind of phased out and replaced by something that is called Gothic. It was not called that in the Middle Ages. It was simply called modern architecture at that point, but Gothic was a label attached to it later. Gothic emphasized the pointed arch, and the pointed arch is a much better weight-bearing mechanism than the rounded arch, and so these buildings could be a lot taller. They could have a lot more light coming into them. There were many more windows, and so things like stained glass replaced, or didn't entirely replace, but came to exist alongside depictions in stone, and probably was the most important artistic medium of that period. And then we'll also look at some artwork associated with specifically the Northern Renaissance, as opposed to the Italian Renaissance. This is 14th, 15th, and early 16th century stuff from the region now occupied by the nations of Belgium and Holland, the Low Countries, as it's often called. And there was an artistic flourishing in that period that did a lot with depictions of judgment. The image on the slide here is a fairly typical one. This is from southern France in a monastic church at in a town called Moissac. This is the Church of Saint Pierre or Saint Peter. And this is a typical Romanesque depiction of judgment. You can see Jesus here. The really large figure Jesus is always portrayed as much larger, indicating his importance. He is most often framed in a kind of almond-shaped frame called the mandorla. And then flanking him are different figures. There are the four beasts, which correspond with the four gospel authors, right? And then if you count them, there are 24 other figures here. If you think back, and I realize this is probably asking you to do a lot, but think back to your reading of the book of Revelation, and you may recall that, in the appearance of the Lamb with the book of life that had the 7 seals on it, there were 24 elders of Zion who were there to greet the Lamb. And so this was, a typical scene of judgment where Jesus would be surrounded by the 4 evangelists, the 4 gospel authors, and the 24 elders of Zion. And this is important for a monastic community because they often use this imagery of the 24 elders of Zion to kind of think about their own vocation. They saw themselves, the monks did, or the nuns, if this is a female community, they saw themselves as corresponding with these elders of Zion who were doing the work of God, greeting the Lamb, worthy to open the book of life and all of that. We looked at this image already, but let me refer back to it. This is, I think, one of the most interesting, maybe the most detailed of the depictions of Last Judgment from the Romanesque period. This is the Church of Sainte Foy in Conques, and we already talked about her, right? We looked at some specific imagery of Sainte Foy herself, kneeling, doing intercession before the hand of God, right? If we move over in the image a little bit, we can see some typical things in these judgment depictions. And some of this is damaged, but this is a person holding up a scale. And actually, you can see the kind of bowls of the scale here, and the person's soul is being weighed. The good and the bad are being weighed. And even though there's a demon here, this is a pretty common depiction. The demon is like pulling down on the scale, trying to make the bad go lower, but actually the good person seems to be winning out. That's a pretty common depiction. You can see people emerging from their tombs here, and the angels are helping them. They're lifting the lids off the tombs. That's another pretty common depiction. And then, this is where people are being greeted at the entrance to heaven by, a figure with a halo. So some kind of saint, these people are going into the door of heaven, whereas these people are being herded into the mouth of hell, which is often depicted as a kind of dragon figure. This looks almost more like a dog, but it's meant to be a dragon. And you can see, this is one of my favorite parts of this whole image. You have this, I don't even know how to describe it. This is a demon of some kind with really cool hair, but it has this large club, and it's like beating people into the mouth of hell, right? And then up here we have depictions of like people suffering in hell and these sorts of things. So this is common. You see depictions of heaven on the right side of Jesus, where his hand is raised to elevate them to that, and then his hand is lowered over here as if to consign them to hell. And you have these two corresponding things. Over here you have the court of heaven. You have at the center of this the figure of Abraham, the Old Testament Hebrew Bible prophet, with children on his lap. That's a pretty common depiction of Abraham iconographically. And then over here, the corresponding court of hell, which is much more chaotic, people suffering, demons inflicting punishment. And here we have the devil standing at the center of the court of hell. And then you have these other saints, like St. Peter always carries a key. If we can look a little more closely at that, you'll see the key in his hand. This is the Virgin Mary. Some of the color is still there. All of this Romanesque art was painted, and you can still see some of the paint from the Middle Ages on this. It may have been touched up over the years. Mary is almost always shown in blue, and you can see a little bit of the blue there on her. And then you have these other figures, including, this is probably the abbot of the monastery, and so the monks of Conques are present as well, right, in the court of heaven, which is quite indicative. They often kind of show themselves there. Here are the gospel authors, and then here are the punishments of hell. So this is a fairly standard, much of the kind of standard imagery that exists is in the image of conch. This is one of my favorites. This is actually something I have written on and presented papers at academic conferences on. This is from the Church of Saint Lazare in Autun. This is another Romanesque piece. This is in kind of eastern France, the region of Burgundy. But here again, you have Jesus, you have the gospel figures kind of flanking him, you have the saints and various others. And then the depiction of heaven, interestingly, is of a nice Romanesque church, right? You can see the rounded arches there in the distance. And here's the souls being weighed in the balance, if I can blow that up a little bit. See the souls being weighed in the balance. Here's the demon pulling down, and then, here are people being herded into the mouth of hell. The interesting part of this one is the lintel here, the thing at the bottom. These are the souls who are being paraded up to the judgment. You can see there's an angel here who is welcoming the people on this side. So these people are all destined for good judgment and for heaven. They're on the right side of Jesus. And these people are all destined for hell. You can even see these demonic hands already grabbing this person. And some of these are identifiable by the specific features of them. Like these two are carrying satchels. That would indicate, and if you look even closer, which I can't blow it up even more to see this, but one of them has a cross on it and one of them has a scallop shell on it. These are pilgrims destined for these great pilgrimage destinations. The cross was carried on was depicted on the satchels of those who were headed for pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and the scallop shell was for those who were headed to Santiago de Compostela. So connecting the ideas of pilgrimage and saints and things from an earlier lecture. This person is wearing chainmail and is probably a crusader. Autun was an important kind of gathering point for the Crusades, and we haven't covered the Crusades in detail at this point. We will a bit later in the class. But it's obvious that the Crusades, if you participate in that will earn you a place in heaven. And then over here we have a couple of bishops holding their staffs, their shepherd's crooks. And I think that, the interpretation I've given in this is these are actually like depictions of the bishop or this one at least, is a depiction of the bishop who commissioned this piece of art. Corresponding with him on this side is a depiction of a heretic. I'm not going to go into details about why I think this is a heretic, but the heretic is doing damage to a Eucharistic wafer, which is a kind of symbol of the body of Christ, meaning the church. And so it's somebody who is hurting the church, either by creating a schism or doing, specific challenging of the doctrines of the church. So, you can learn to read these things, and it becomes quite fascinating to see all of the ideas circulating. In the Gothic period, Chartres Cathedral is one of the most important pieces of Gothic architecture. It's probably my favorite church in all of Europe, actually. But you can see the kind of simplification of this. Here is Jesus with the four the four evangelists, and down here we have the elders of Zion again. That's because, the emphasis, and Chartres Cathedral in the Gothic period, a lot of the effort was put into glass, into the stained glass, the intricacy of that. And, they kind of continued with the very simple depictions of things like judgment. It was still an important part of the iconography and of the artistic display of the church, but they were less perhaps interested in, these elaborate depictions of these things. Reims Cathedral is also a Gothic one, and I have given you a link in the modules, and so you can click on this. This is actually a kind of clickable thing where you can look at specific details of Reims Cathedral. And so I'd encourage you to have a look at this, right? You can click on this. I've clicked on A here, and this is the top part. Here we see Jesus, of course, larger than everyone else, and he is flanked by, the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist. Actually, this is John the Baptist, and then there are, some angels and others over here, right? There are some other fairly common kinds of things, like we talked about Abraham, in the court of heaven. Here it is again, Abraham with a child on his lap. That actually comes from a New Testament teaching of Jesus about Abraham's bosom and Lazarus, which is a story I don't need to go into detail about. But anyway, that's a pretty common depiction on these things. So, take a look at that, click on each of these, try to see what's going on there, see the ideas in motion, as it were. Let's move briefly to the Northern Renaissance. This is where things get quite rich in color. The stonework of these earlier art pieces of art, this would have been painted, but the paint has deteriorated over time, and so we kind of lose the color. We may get a sense of how vivid that may have been by looking at these these Northern Renaissance pieces. This is the Last Judgment the altarpiece, and so one of the most common pieces, like types of art, media for art in the late Middle Ages and the Northern Renaissance were altarpieces, and so they would put these, these would be commissioned by a church to be placed on the altar, and often these are very large things, like 10 feet tall. I don't think the Memling judgment piece is that large, but it is several feet tall and maybe like 10 feet wide. It's currently in Poland, which is where it ended up from a long history of transmission. But you can see here, there's a lot of the same imagery. It's just depicted in a slightly different fashion, and there is an increasing emphasis on hell. They're able to show this in great detail, right? So let's look at hell here. One of the things you may note is that some of the people in hell have these bald spots on their head. That means this is what's called the tonsure. And this is indicative of people who were priests or monks or clergymen. In other words, Memling is saying here that just being a priest does not earn you a place in heaven. If you abuse that office, if you do something bad, that will land you in hell, right? So the hell panel is quite interesting here. They're, in the painting, they're able to show a lot more detail than in the stonework. Jesus is seated on a rainbow now. This becomes a kind of common depiction. Over here we have the Virgin Mary and various other saints kind of attending this. And then these angels are holding the instruments of the passion, like the flail and the cross and the nails and the crown of thorns. These are the things that were there, part of Jesus' crucifixion. Here is the archangel Michael doing the weighing of the souls in the balance. And then over here we have, this is St. Peter specifically. You can tell by the key. Peter's always shown with a key, and he is greeting people. And they are then, being paraded up here. They're being given clothing. They all emerge from their graves naked. They are being given clothing. You can still see some clergymen here, some priests by the tonsures. So some of them end up in heaven. There are women here, men here, right? And they're being taken off to this nice Gothic building in the sky, right, which is the depiction of heaven. My absolute favorite piece that shows judgment is Hieronymus Bosch's The Garden of Earthly Delights. And to try to do any kind of justice to this piece of art in short form is ridiculous. I have given you a link to this, which would take you to this page. This is actually the link from the Museo del Prado in Madrid, where this piece of art is housed. And I went to Madrid a few years ago specifically to see this painting. There was a big display of most of the surviving pieces of Hieronymus Bosch. There are 25 paintings of his that have survived. And I went there and spent a couple of hours in that exhibit, and I spent about 45 minutes in front of this painting trying to elbow other people out of the way. There was a huge crowd looking at this thing. But I probably shouldn't have done that, because honestly you can see it in much greater detail here. Bosch turns a lot of things on their head. This is what's called the Surrealist style of Northern Renaissance. Instead of showing heaven on the left side, he shows the Garden of Eden. But what's interesting about the Garden of Eden is, here you have God instructing Adam and Eve, it seems, but already there are some bad things happening. Like here is a cat who has caught a mouse. Here are these creatures, one of which, look at this lizard salamander thing. It has 3 heads. There are owls and other dark creatures. Owls show up a lot in the paintings of Bosch, and they're a symbol of evil. Evil is already there. There are these primeval creatures crawling out of the water, right? All ready to tempt Adam and Eve and consign them to something. And so the Garden of Eden isn't all it's cracked up to be, okay? There's a lot of evil already present there. And then the central panel seems to be, indicative of This is what's happening in this world. People are enjoying the pleasures of the flesh. There's a lot of very, very overtly sexual imagery going on here. A lot of, kind of kinky stuff, honestly. If you look closely, I'm not going to draw attention to any specific details. Two of my favorites are kind of off here in the distance. We have a bunch of people seemingly like worshiping a strawberry. And then over next to them, we have a bunch of people either crawling into or out of a cracked egg. Like, what on earth is that supposed to mean? Here we have a big procession around a pond, and we got a bunch of naked people frolicking in the pond, some of whom seem to be of African origin. Bosch depicts them as black, right? And I mean black. But they're riding various beasts kind of going around and around and around. And Bosch's message, and this is heavily debated among scholars, seems to be that, this is a criticism of people's appetites for the flesh, that they are too given to sensual pursuits. And a lot of this is depicted as things like fruit. Here we have people like with a large blackberry, and then, as I said, the strawberry over here. So we got these various fruits that seem to be tempting them. That may be, again, indicative of, the fall, that Adam and Eve fell, and they did it by eating fruit, and now people are just like worshiping the fruit over here. And then, even weirder, honestly, is the depiction of hell. I mean, it is really something to see. We've got this, city in the background, and then just really weird stuff. Like, look at these ears with a knife coming out of them. Like, why? Why is that there? And then this figure that's colloquially called the Eggman, which is, seems to have like tree branches growing out of it that are piercing its own. And then there are things like inside of it, right? Instruments of punishment are often musical instruments. Like this person seems to be like impaled on a harp, in the strings of the harp, there are, this is an instrument called the hurdy-gurdy, which is like turned with a crank, but this crank is like piercing the person's anus, to call it what it is. Okay. You can see other, kind of depictions of things that land people in hell, like dice. And down here we have like a knife sticking into a hand, which is holding a die at the top of it, right? So the torments of hell are just shown in harrowing and weird fashion here, right? So take a look at that, puzzle over it, have a gander. This is my favorite piece of art that I've ever seen. It's my favorite piece of art in all of world history, but I don't have a lot of answers for what's going on in the imagination of Hieronymus Bosch. It just shows how rich the material was. To think about judgment, to think about heaven and hell, could lead people to some place so strange as this, right? So I think that's good for today. If you want to talk about these things further, if you want to use a piece of art to analyze as evidence either in the primary source analysis paper or as your primary source worksheet source, you can do that. You can do, one of these pieces of art we've looked at here, including this one, if you like.